Hi, I'm Cory Driver, and this is Moving Forward. So this week we are staying in Matthew 13, and we're talking about wheat and weeds. So here's this parable, and it's Jesus sets it out as a householder sows seed in his field, and before it comes up, the enemy also sows bad seed in the field. It grows and it grows up, and once it starts bearing grain, the servants come and they say, "Master, an enemy has done a bad thing to us and sown evil grain, and it's come up. Should we pull it up?" And the master says, No, for if you do so, you might disrupt and pull up the wheat as well that I sowed. So let it grow up, and then at the end of the age, or at harvest time, we will separate out the good seed, the good fruit, the good wheat, and the weeds, which will be bound up and thrown into the fire. Now, the first thing we need to do is diagram this parable in order to really focus on what it is about. Happily, Jesus has already done the work for us. So the sower or the householder is the Son of Man, Jesus. The field is the earth. The good seed are the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one. The enemy is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age. And the reapers and or servants are angels. I want to make 3 points about this parable. The first is this. From diagramming the parable, we know right away that this parable is not about separating ourselves or not separating ourselves from other people, which we think are bad seeds or whatever. That's not the job of humans in this passage. Look back. The slaves and the reapers are angels who don't separate. The wheat and the weeds are the humans in the passage. A wheat stalk plant does not uproot itself and move itself. Similarly, a weed, unless there's some botanical variety that I don't know about, similarly does not uproot itself and move itself. Separating yourself or not separating yourself from other people who think differently than you or whatever is not what this passage is about. It doesn't make sense in the parable. Plants don't move themselves. You're stuck together. Having an alternative society and separating yourselves from others is not the point. Pastors, if you're watching this, please don't preach about this as Jesus telling us not to separate ourselves from others, because that's not the point. The angels don't separate folks from other folks, right? Like, humans don't have a choice. That's the first. The second point that I want to make is that this passage, like so many other passages in Matthew, are about producing good fruit. When do the angels, when do the servants of the master in this passage notice that wheat and weeds have been growing together? It's in verse 26. It's after the grain shows up, then the weeds show up as well. It's not before. You can't tell. They're together, they're growing up the same, the shoots, the buds, all that looks the same. But it's once it produces grain, right? And the wheat produces grain, and the weeds here, the Greek word is zizania, which is probably a loan word from Hebrew, zunin, which is a bearded tear. It looks like wheat as it's growing, and it produces a dark grain that then hosts a fungus, which is actually toxic to humans. And so Jesus couldn't have been starker in the comparison here. So the angels are recognizing the difference in the wheat and the weeds by what is produced. The wheat produces that fundamental staple of human consumption. It's grain for bread. Yummy. We all love fresh baked bread. What we don't all love is being poisoned, right? And that's what's the produce of the weeds, is producing stuff that's toxic and injurious to humans, that is readily apparent. Just by looking at the field, you can say, oh, that's good grain. That's helpful. That's yummy for my body, as my kids would say. And by looking at the same field, you say, oh, that's dark and it seems to have some fungus growing on it. I will not make bread out of that. That will be yucky for my body, again, as my children say. Like Matthew 7:16-20 and 12:33, this is a parable about producing good fruit and how the kingdom of heaven is recognized by humans producing good fruit for the kingdom. This is not about separating ourselves or not. It is about producing good fruit. Now, there's some worry, right, in this passage about like, ooh, they kind of look the same, the weeds and the wheat at a very young age, like it's hard to tell them apart, but it's readily apparent to everyone who looks at the field, oh, some of these plants are producing good fruit, and some are producing toxic fruit, or fruit that is home to toxicity. And so the concern about maybe the anxiety about, oh, these look the same, how do you tell them apart? That's not in the passage. That's not in the parable. It's readily apparent just by looking at it. You don't have to taste that, ooh, there's some bad fruit. The third point I want to make is about Jesus's patience. The master of the household says to the servant reapers, just wait. Don't tear up anything now. The good fruit, or the good plants, are going to produce good fruit, and the bad fruit, just wait on it. And the whole point of Jesus pronouncing these parables and teaching and reaching out to people and going places and sitting on a boat with a crowd so great that he has to go out into the Sea of Galilee to speak to them, is that there's hope for the weeds, which is good news because we're all weeds. We don't naturally, I don't know about you all, but I don't naturally produce good fruit all the time. I produce stuff that's toxic. And so the whole point of Jesus preaching and then dying and then being resurrected is that there's hope for the weeds, that you can be turned into a different sort of plant that produces good grain, good fruit that isn't toxic anymore. That's what the kingdom of heaven does. When God grabs you through the salvific work of Jesus, we're meant to make good fruit, to make good wheat afterwards. God has done all the salvific work. We are saved. And then, as my Methodist siblings say, we've been freed for joyful obedience, right? And so we have a task to do, and it is to produce good grain, to produce good fruit. What the parable is saying is that it will be immediately clear by the kind of fruit we produce, by the kind of grain we produce in our life, whether we are children of heaven or children of the evil one. The good news is there's hope that weeds, such as we all are, can be turned into wheat. But we need to produce good fruit, good grain that nourishes people, that provides sustenance for folk. And we need to, at a very, very base level, not be poisonous, right? And so in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is very, very concerned with what people do, whether they produce good fruit, good grain, good bread, or whether they produce toxic grain, right? So let us produce good grain. We have a God and a master who is patient and kind and not willing that any would perish. We also have a Lord who cares about what we produce. This passage is not about separating ourselves or not. That's not what it is. It's about, are you producing good fruit, good grain that feeds other people, or are you producing toxic stuff that hurts other people? It will be apparent.